on postmodernism and the burden of proof. Hey everybody, it's Prince of Queens, and I was actually thinking today about something that I was able to finally put together in my head in terms of just how annoying this whole little thing of burden of proof actually tends to be. Because leftists, and in particular postmodernist type people, and keep in mind, the left is basically saturated with postmodernism at a subconscious level. Like the collective unconscious of the leftist zeitgeist has forced basically the entire populace of the left into being postmodernists from birth subconsciously. It is ingrained into people like my own's subconscious in every way that they possibly can. And I honestly think that mainly the only real reason that I snapped out of it as an individual was due to taking a lot of mind-altering substances and moving to various different cities. Like, I took a lot of LSD when I was a teenager, and then I also eventually moved to New York City, where things were drastically different than Seattle, where I grew up. And so I was able to realize that I had been conditioned to see the world as this weird hodgepodge of subjective reality where nobody's perspective is more valuable than the other and blah, 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 blah. And you can't prove that somebody's right or wrong about something. And actually, right and wrong are really limiting concepts because maybe there is no right and wrong. And like, all of that stuff was actually put into me, and I always was a bit skeptical of it, mainly because I didn't really respect all that many people who are trying to put that mentality into me as an individual. But it took until college where I just started to realize that it was all just totally stupid. Like, I was like, wait, this is dumb. This is just completely dumb. But it's really only been till now that I've started to realize why it probably came about. And one of the reasons why was explained by a man named Stephen Hicks in a video that you can watch on Philosophy Insights, the channel that takes excerpts from people who are giving speeches and stuff like that. Well, this man, Stephen Hicks, was also interviewed by Sargon, so I checked him out on YouTube and watched some of his other things about postmodernism, because everybody's talking about postmodernism and Jordan B. Peterson and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, I have the fundamentals of how postmodernism works and operates. I've dealt with these people my entire life. I know their playbook. I know what they're going to say. I know the types of arguments they make, and I know the type of ways in which they're going to make these arguments, and I can usually imagine why they're probably doing it. It's not hard for me to figure out the motivation. But what I didn't understand was the history of it coming into being and how it transitioned from Marxism into postmodernism and why. And apparently it's actually fairly simple from Stephen Hicks's observation. And this makes a lot of sense to me, which is basically that Marxism, Marx lived during the 19th century. He was in the 1800s, was when he was writing his books. And through the end of the 19th century, all through the mid-1950s, a lot of people really, really, really believed that we could have communist utopian civilizations on Earth. Like, we were maybe going to transfer into that within the 20th century, supposedly. And that was supposedly happening in the Soviet Union and in China. This was supposed to be this great system, and maybe it was really working, and Western democracies were saying, no, it's not good, it's not working, and it was easy for Western communist type people to demonize them and say, well, you're just CIA propagandists, it's not true, it's blah, 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 blah. And of course, the Soviet Union and China was keeping the numbers of all of the people that were being tortured, starved, murdered from the West, because they wanted to convert the entire world into a communist sort of dictatorship. I'm not sure if Mao or Stalin was supposed to be the leader, but they wanted that to happen, right? And so we didn't actually know in the Western world that all of the millions and millions and, tens of millions of people were being murdered, starved, tortured to death. We just didn't know about that kind of thing. And in the 1950s, there was all sorts of Marxist type people in academia, and they were relatively low key about it, but they were there. They were definitely there in the Western world. And then finally, the proof came out. Journalists were able to get into the Soviet Union and into Red China. And sure enough, yeah, all these people were being massacred, starved to death, tortured. And everybody realized that, yep, this didn't actually work out. This little experiment called communism doesn't actually lead to a utopian civilization. It leads to monstrosities. And from what I understand, this is just my interpretation of listening to the data. And so I will leave you the presentation that Stephen Hicks gave about this sort of thing. And yeah, go watch him in various different places. I encourage you. I think that he has a lot of insights into postmodernism. What I would guess is basically simply this. There were some philosophy professors who were Marxists, and they believed that the world was going to end up in some sort of Marxist utopia, and they were framing their philosophy in terms of that. Because philosophy professors are never just philosophy professors. They're always into art and politics as well. That's how philosophy works. That's how philosophy professors are. Because philosophy by itself is a very nebulous thing. So you have to kind of apply it to various different things in life. And so I think these philosophy professors, once they were confronted with the horrible realization that, they were advocating for Marxism in the West, at least subtly through their teaching, because they were Marxist true believers. And once they were confronted with the personal realization that this led to mass murder, mass starvation, and potentially even some would call it genocide in various different places. Once they were confronted with that, I think that probably more than anything, they just felt really guilty for telling people that the future was Marx. The future was Marxism. So once they started feeling really guilty and were presented with the logic, I believe a number of them started coming up with postmodernism. And postmodernism is really just a way, from everything I understand about it, for these people, these guys who came up with postmodernism, to pretend that the facts don't actually matter anymore, because if the facts mattered, then they'd have to own up to the responsibility that maybe they contributed to this ideology that was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. They just feel really guilty. And so they come up with a way of justifying it and rationalizing it, both to themselves, to the academies that they work at, and, the universities that they work at, the students that they're teaching, so that those students and everybody starts to believe that, hey, maybe their professional reputation as a Marxist philosopher shouldn't be entirely thrown in the garbage, despite the fact that we know that what they've been teaching over the past however many years is actually completely destructive. And if this was taken to its full conclusion, it could theoretically and almost certainly definitely lead to tens of millions of deaths. So it was just backpedaling. It was just this intellectual form of backpedaling espoused by career philosophers who felt guilty. That's what I'm guessing. That's my interpretation of what probably happened, but I haven't studied it enough to really understand. So yeah, that's how we got to where we are with postmodernism. And I think that once those people, I don't think that a lot of them probably truly believed it. I think that they were just trying to protect their reputations as philosophy professors or whatever. I bet. That's just my guess. But a number of people did start to believe it because those guys were actually really clever and they wrote things that sort of sounded like they made sense to other people. And then other people started to actually believe it. And then they started taking what they had said about postmodernism and running with it. And then you think people like the feminists who fully believe it, because feminists are just, I don't know, they're really, really gullible people that don't necessarily think for themselves. And I don't really think that they ever have been. Anybody who actually sits around thinking to themselves, oh, wouldn't the world be better if we just didn't have men? If we could just get rid of them, the guys who do all this stuff in society that's hard. Can we just get rid of them? Because sometimes they're mean. Well, these are not smart people, and I think that they are not very independent-minded, because if somebody told you that and you actually thought it was a good idea, it's because you're really gullible and really dumb. So I think that what happened is that these feminist type people got into this postmodernist idea, and it sort of shaped their worldview, and they started being able to disregard reality in whatever way they wanted. It was just a tool for them to, it was almost as if postmodernism was initially just a backpedaling device for careerists in the philosophy field, and then that backpedaling action by itself became a seed, and then the seed was planted and grew into saplings that were basically zombie abominations of ideas. And these ideas were people like the postmodernist gender deconstructionist feminists and the critical race theory people. These people actually believed the postmodernist stuff, which had only served the purpose of protecting the careers of the professors. I don't know. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, because if I'm drastically wrong about this in some way, like maybe there are some of the professors that actually believed it. They convinced themselves that they weren't just protecting their careers by, using postmodernism to apologize for being Marxists. Maybe there's something a little bit more to it than that, but that's what I'm going to go with for the time being. And then they started just pulling this weird nonsense every step of the way. And I've encountered this weird nonsense numerous times in my life. And one of the biggest ways that they bring it up is with this concept of burden of proof. Now, I'm sure that burden of proof comes up a lot in various different discussions, and I'm sure postmodernists did not invent it. But, postmodernism has been around for probably over 60 years, at least 50. So the idea of burden of proof is this notion where if two people can't agree on something and one person says, okay, you just said something that you should probably prove. Could you please prove it? Well, the other person gets to deflect and worm around actually proving it by saying, why is the burden of proof on me? Shouldn't you have to prove what you're saying? And so there you can get into talking about things like heteronormativity, right? So the notion of heteronormativity revolves around this notion of burden of proof. Because yes, heterosexuality is normal. Our species would not have evolved if homosexuality was the norm, because homosexuality does not create babies. It's pretty obvious. So I am technically abnormal as a homosexual, right? I'm gay. That makes me non-normal. But people who are postmodernists who talk about heteronormativity would go on to say, well, but why is heterosexuality the default? Why should that be considered normal? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't know, common sense. But of course, these are people that they are actively trying to avoid common sense, because that was what this whole notion of postmodernism, I believe, was probably predicated upon. I believe that postmodernism came into being as a result of people saying, oh crap, how do we destroy common sense? Because if I have to deal with common sense, then I don't have a career anymore in the philosophy department at my university. So heteronormativity, that's obviously common sense that heterosexual people are the norm, but supposedly that's actually placing the burden of proof on non-heterosexual people to prove that like if I were to say that homosexuality is actually more normal than heterosexuality, and you said, where's the evidence for this? I could deflect and say, well, you're putting the burden of proof on me, and therefore you're a bad person, especially because you are the dominant cultural paradigm, or I don't know. Like, that's the type of thing that they would do. It's silly. And I've noticed this happen with feminists in the past. One time I was arguing with a feminist, and I don't remember what the argument was about anymore, and she said something that was just untrue. And I was like, that's just not true, And she said, yes, it's true. And I said, no, it's not. And in order for you to say that, you would have to provide me with some evidence. And not only did she say that that was an unfair thing for me to ask of her, but she added the extra implication that I was asking her of the burden of proof, and I was putting upon her the burden of proof, and that was an unfair thing for me to do because that was actually misogynistic, because she's a woman and women are subjected to having to prove that they are worth something and that their ideas are valid more often than men. And so for me to even ask her for evidence of what she was talking about, well, that was an offense to her as an individual because I was asking her to provide the burden of proof. So this is a really annoying concept because, okay, I'm sorry, but there is such a thing as normalcy. There is such a thing as common sense. And when you slap normalcy and common sense in the face, you are the one that deserves to have to justify yourself. So if we were to believe back in the day that the sun revolved around the earth, and you would have to prove that if you were Galileo, you would have to prove that. Because it does appear from the Earth's perspective that the sun is revolving around us. And you would have to provide some strong evidence for that. But what if Galileo thought that he didn't have to do that? And he just got to say, why is the burden of proof on me? All you should have to do is provide evidence that the sun revolves around the Earth. And it's just like, shut up, dude, get out of here. So that all said, I came across this just today, and it was very annoying. I was having a discussion with some people that are registered Democrats, like actually work for the Democratic Party, and they were trying to say that I'm a Republican, and even though I'm not, I've never voted for a Republican ever once, but they were trying to say that I'm a Republican and that I was saying Republican propaganda, and all I was saying is that places like NPR and PBS seem to just be shills for the Democratic Party now. And the thing that I mentioned was that in 2012, Obama signed into law a bill that legalized the usage of propaganda on the American people by overturning the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948. I'm one of the only people that talks about this, but you can look it up for yourself. It happened. Now, I am not entirely sure what the extent of that happening really means, but it's been reported upon in numerous places that Obama legalized the usage of propaganda on the American people. And that's honestly all you really need to know in terms of looking at PBS and NPR, because ever since 2012, they are not reputable sources at all. It's very obvious. And, PBS got to the point where they were trying to say that the word egalitarianism supposedly is actually a conspiracy concocted by MRAs to discredit feminism, which is the true force of equality. And MRAs somehow hatched this plan to come up with this word egalitarian, which, I don't know, surprisingly, oddly looks a lot like equal to me. But really, no, it was just the MRAs coming up with this word that looks like equal, but feminism, which looks like female, actually means equality more so. PBS said that. And we're supposed to believe that this is a non-biased platform that is supplied their funding by the public. So, yeah, I don't think that this is hard to figure out what's going on here. Like, now that we know that propaganda is legal, and we know that one party is the party of feminism, that's the Democrats, and that they were the sitting federal government that legalized the usage of propaganda on the American people, even though I do believe that they were a minority in the House at that time. Still, it's pretty much like putting two and two together to assume that they were the ones paying for PBS to start saying such obviously untrue things. Because we all know that by 2012, literally every media outlet was struggling to make ends meet because of the internet. And public broadcasting really didn't have any real merit in the way that it used to, because everybody could publicly broadcast. So they had every bit of a motive to just take money from the Democratic Party, even though they hadn't prior. So I made that statement. I cited my source. I said, yeah, the Smith-Mundt Act was overturned in 2012. And some woman said, oh, that's interesting. Do you have a source on that? And I said, yeah, you can look at the article on Business Insider and you can actually read the bill yourself because they have to publish it. The federal government does. And so she said, oh, okay. And then she responds and she said, well, I went and I looked at it and these are actually separate issues. What you're talking about isn't true because the Smith-Mundt Act only applies to the state and state-sanctioned propaganda. And the Democratic Party isn't the state. It's not the state government. It's a party or something like that. And it's just like, oh my God. Wait, what? Oh, wait, so you don't understand that the Democrats and the government are not entirely mutually exclusive? Like if a Democratic person gets elected into office, they don't magically become not a Democrat anymore or something. Or if a Democrat appoints, I don't know, a head of an FBI, that person, despite the fact that the head of the FBI is nonpartisan, that person was still appointed by a partisan person. Like she's trying to pretend like that. Oh my God. I'm just not going to cater to taking apart her illogic piece by piece because I feel like that would be falling into the postmodernist game that she's trying to play here. And she also said that, I don't know what else she said, but she tried to just say, nuh-uh, that's not how things work. I don't believe you. And I'm like, okay, whatever you just said didn't cut mustard or did not pass mustard, did not cut butter, did not cut turkey. Whatever you just said did not convince me at all. Like, I just told you that propaganda was legalized on the American people. And your response was to say, well, okay, that was like kind of true, but I don't think it really was because reasons. And I'm like, no. Your reasons aren't good. You need to explain why it wasn't true. And she said, I think that the burden of proof should be on you. I don't think I should have to explain this. I think that you are the one who made the accusation that the Democratic Party was funneling money into PBS and NPR. You're the one who should have to prove it. And it was just astounding that she was willing to just bury her head in the sand and say such a thing to me, because I wasn't saying that the Democratic Party was doing something illegally. I was saying that they legalized it. And so that it was legally allowed for them to be doing this. And so that I assumed that they obviously were because of the fact that it was legal. And it seems like they sure are. And she said, no, I don't think that they are. And she was like, well, you have to prove that they are. And I'm like, well, I can't prove something that was perfectly legal because there's nobody that's going to do an investigation about something that's perfectly legal. And the metaphor I used was to describe, look, let's say you lived in a country where water sports, playing with urine sexually, was completely illegal. Well, you could prove that your neighbor was partaking in this illegal activity if you were to, I don't know, spy on them and see them in the shower pissing all over their wife or something, right? You could prove that and maybe give it to your local police authorities for, perverted acts that would be illegal in that country, right? But if water sports is perfectly legal, if urinating all over your husband or wife is perfectly legal, nobody's going to start trying to prove that, because then you'd just be a peeping Tom, right? So the burden of proof absolutely has to be on her. She has to prove why it's not legal, like why the Democratic Party shouldn't be doing this or why they aren't, because as far as anybody else can tell, it's perfectly within their legal right to do so. So unless it's not, which she sort of implied that she thinks is the case, then they probably are doing it. Why should the burden of proof be on me to really, really prove that they definitely are? Like, that's asking for, like, I'm not the bookkeeper at PBS. I don't know. It's just like postmodernism is just entirely a game of deflection, I guess. Okay, bye. Oh, and I know I said I was going to script a video, but this was just too irritating. And I also was on a live stream earlier today, and I have scripted videos. I have two different ones that I want to read, but yeah. Okay, I'll do them soon. Okay, bye.